Literary fiction has long been one of the most affecting genres of literature for me, but I also find it one of the most difficult genres to pin down. And part of this might be that it is very difficult to describe exactly what one means by literary fiction. And it can really differ depending on who's speaking. For example, my version of literary fiction, my perspective on what exactly qualifies as literary fiction may be very different than somebody else's. I think a part of this is because it is really a catch all genre for serious or deep or profound works of literature, which can make the category kind of fluffy and potentially meaningless as a category. But technically, literary fiction could include any novel. But often it can just be the books that don't really fit neatly into other categories, at least from a marketing perspective when you see it in a bookstore. And then when those books become old and important and they're still remembered, they move from literary fiction to just classics. And I see it the same way. From my perspective, something like East of Eden, as much as it might be literary fiction in certain respects, is far more closely tied to the classics category. Whereas when I read something like the works of Kazuo Ishiguro as an example, I see that as more literary fiction, but that's also my perspective. And to me, it's always been those very introspective and philosophically minded books, often related to concepts like memory and questions of one's past and reflection and rumination on those things. Sometimes they also are emotionally restrained and have inventive aspects to those categories, but they're books that are interested in consciousness, in individuals, more than in plot. Now, many of the books I associate with this style really come from the latter half of the 20th century. So, as I mentioned earlier, something like the work of Steinbeck might not be considered a literary fiction book from my perspective, or The Great Gatsby, or The Bell Jar, even though that would be an antecedent to this category. The works of Virginia Woolf, as an example, not that I've read, I need to read a lot more Virginia Woolf, to be honest, but a lot of her works very much tie into this idea of literary fiction in terms of their interiority and their kind of appreciation of consciousness, I guess we could say. But this list is really not an attempt to define this literary category objectively. All I want to do here is talk about my experience reading novels that have a very particular idea that I'm going to call 10 of my favorite works of memory-driven literary fiction. Now, the first one is very popular, Stoner by John Williams. This is one that I read for the first time this year. It's probably one of the clearest examples of what I mean by this category. My definition would probably line up immediately with Stoner. Now, I hadn't read it when I fell in love with this style of writing, so reading Stoner was a really amazing experience to me. It was a transcendent experience almost. The premise of the story is you have this young man named Stoner, William Stoner, and he grows up on this farm, and his parents send him away to college so that he can study architecture, can study agriculture. They're very different, so that he'll be able to come back and he can basically work on the farm. But he falls in love with literature and reading while he's in college. And he decides to go in a different direction. He decides he can't return to the farm, and partially through the guidance of a professor and a relationship that he has there, he becomes a professor himself. Then he marries, he has a kid, and it follows his life as he grows and as he goes through the vicissitudes, the ups and downs, the challenges of life. Now, he never becomes famous or like a big shot in the academic world or anything like this. He's pretty respectable, but pretty ordinary. And even his depth of knowledge and love for literature doesn't really help shield him from the strings and arrows of life and the challenges that he has to go through. He has a rather unhappy marriage, and yet his ordinariness really makes he's extraordinary in his ordinariness. I think that's what makes this novel so meaningful when you're reading it. He doesn't change things. It's not an Odyssean story of fighting monsters and rising above. He's using literature, and it's not like it saves him or anything, but he uses it to grow and to not even grow really, like just to navigate life, I guess we could say. And there's meaning that's found in small moments. There are mistakes and failures, but there are also moments of beauty found in the midst of challenging situations. I think few books can really explore themes of the ordinary in such an extraordinary way. And that's what makes Stoner such a wonderful book. Now, the second one on this list is A Separate Piece by John Knowles. This is another one that I read for the first time this year. and immediately felt at home in this category. It's set in New England, and you have these kids, these two kids at this boarding school during the Second World War. But it's not really about the external story. It's about the internal story between these two characters. So you have Forrester, who's the main character, and his friend Finney, or Phineas is his full name. Phineas is this kind of charismatic, athletic boy, and the narrator loves him, but he also kind of has jealousy for him, and it's this complicated relationship. And there's one particular moment that I don't want to spoil, where something happens, and the whole novel is about this narrator going back through his memory and trying to understand what actually happened. What was his actual motivation? Also, what were the actual events that happened? What was his intention initially? Did he understand it accurately? Or did his self-image kind of change the way that he saw this? Is he hiding from anything? And I think it's interesting that this book is also set in the backdrop of the Second World War, because you see all these themes of war and destruction on a much larger scale, and then questions on a much more intimate scale that's happening simultaneously. Those are the ones that we're more interested in. It's a very investigative novel. Themes of guilt and friendship and the terrifying possibilities of what were our intentions when we did some of the actions that we did, and for the good or for the bad. It really, really causes you to stop and reflect. And I think that's what I love about this genre. So the second recommendation is A Separate Piece by John Knowles. The third one is IQ84 by Haruki Murakami. Now, I actually am a big Murakami fan. Some of his books I haven't been able to get into. I started reading South of the Border, West of the Sun recently, and I just haven't been able to get into it. It could be that it's maybe just not the right time to read that book. Just it was different than what I was expecting, and sometimes that contrast can make a book not right for you at a particular time. I don't want to poison anyone against reading that book. It could very well be a great one, but IQ84 was far and away my favorite book by Murakami that I've read. I liked The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle as well, and Kafka on the Shore and some of his other ones, but IQ84, it's so big, and its themes of magical realism and bringing you into this other very different but also somewhat similar to our world, I just thought was super fascinating. Now, it's kind of hard to summarize the plot because it's such a big story, but basically you have this woman who enters a different world. She notices the world around her is really changed, and there's darker realities, there's two moons, there's all of this, the world is just slightly different. And then there's this other character named Tango, and he's rewriting this kind of weird book, and it's describing these little people, but then the little people actually are in the real world, and they're related to this. There's so many interconnections. I feel like if I'm trying to explain this really specifically, I'm gonna kind of go off the track. But suffice it to say that there's a lot of magical realism elements. Like there's multiple moons in this world. There's a religious cult, which is also based on a real religious cult, somewhat partially based on Om Shinrikyo, which was the religious cult in Japan in the 90s that led to the sarin gas attacks. And so it's very interesting, and it's exploring a lot of the underside of Japanese society through this novel, which Murakami is really great at. He also explores, in some of his other novels, also slightly in this one too, the horrors of the Second World War and the atrocities that the Japanese committed during that war as well, which is not as well documented as, for example, the Germans and the stuff that happened with the Russians as well during the Second World War, which I think we know a lot more about. At least it's more common knowledge. But really, this book is about parallel histories happening in a world that's like ours, but not quite ours, that is centered around a love story with lonely people that are really trying to find meaning in life, which is so Murakami. And I guess it makes sense to have a Murakami pick and be unable to really summarize it sufficiently, because that is kind of what makes Murakami amazing. He doesn't have simple plots, and it's not why you read his books either. You read them for the sentiment, not for the specific things that happen. Now, it's a very long novel. It's very dreamlike. It has moments that feel like you're kind of falling into a pattern and a rhythm, But I think that it's a really beautiful exploration of altered consciousness. And for me, at least, it was a very meaningful read. Number 4 on this list is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Now, this one almost feels a little bit like the most outlier on this list because it's not quite what I associate with the exact brand of literary fiction that I'm going for here, but it's very close in certain respects, specifically with the ideas of memory and reflection on life. And Janie Crawford, the main character, is, I think, a very strong example of that character looking back on her life, on her own story, and telling it to you through her own specific voice, which is a big theme here. She passes several different marriages. She's looking for love in different visions, the kind of stability form of love and providing, the fun form of love, and then ultimately a more meaningful, grounded form of love later on as she becomes a more mature person. And I think that journey, that exploration is just really, really beautiful. I think really, though, at the end of the day, Hurston is a genius, and this is one of her great works. This might be her greatest work. And she comes from a time, she was a really uninterested, I think, in writing political or racial novels, but she was a Black woman who grew up in the South and was familiar from her family history and, with slavery and growing up just after slavery. And she herself wrote certain aspects of her experience into this story, but it's not autobiographical or anything like certain of her other books maybe are more so. This book is really an exploration of the character of Janie reclaiming her own life, though, and deciding what life she wants to live. Her grandmother in the story was a slave, and so she wants Janie to have protection and stability. But Janie realizes that that's not all there is. But then she also goes to the other extreme and is just seeking love without any responsibility, and she realizes that that's a disaster as well, and she tries to find that kind of balance in between the two. Hurston, I think, really captures a very poetic vision of Janie's consciousness, which is what I love about this book and what really puts it in this category for me. It's not just a book about the story, which could be maybe more like a classic, but it's a book that explores how one's consciousness, one's idealizing of love, one's idealizing of stability can prove to be true or false, can lead to transformations or the possibility of transformations in our life. And not just that, the way that it impacts who we become generally. Now, this book has a wonderful voice. Some of the sentences here are unbelievable. It's just one of the most well-written books I've ever read personally. And I think the themes of memory and of freedom and trying to tell one's own story are very strong and very much within this category. Now, number 5 on this list is An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of the greatest books, I think, in this particular genre that is not talked about so much. I mean, Ishiguro's most famous works are definitely The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go. Those are the ones I hear talked about the most. But An Artist of the Floating World was one that I really, really, really liked reading. I might have even liked it as much as those other ones, or it's certainly, in my mind, kind of on a similar level. And I think, well, Ishiguro does appear multiple times on this list, so obviously I have great appreciation for his writing, partly because he really embodies that type of literary fiction that I really love. But An Artist of the Floating World is really, it's really unique as far as the story goes. It tells the story of Masuji Ono, I think is how you pronounce his name, and he's this old Japanese painter who's reflecting back on his life after the Second World War. Now, he was a painter for the essentially fascist or ultra-nationalist, however you want to talk about it, imperial Japanese theology, ideology. That was the way he saw the world. And he once believed that he was using his art in service of this great thing, this national power. But then in post-war Japan, obviously those values have become discredited. They've been completely lost. And so as the country is changing all around him, he has to kind of reconceptualize his identity, his being within this framework, and also grapple with his responsibility for the past. But Ishiguro doesn't give us like straightforward confessions like, oh, I shouldn't have done this, and I'm so like, Ono's character is always revising the way that he sees his life. as new information comes about. And he's trying to do this in the most favorable way. Like he'll have an earlier memory and then he'll kind of contradict it as you go further on. And the way that Ishiguro reveals it, it's not in a linear order or anything like this. And so you get slightly more insights and you start to realize this is slightly different than what you thought it was. And this character might have had actually a little bit more culpability, even though he was very persuasively explaining to you how he didn't initially on. But really, as we go further on, we gradually realize that this imperfect memory is not a failure. It's something that Ono's character needs to do in order to survive. He's like using it as a defense mechanism. And that's an even more terrifying realization, I think, than the idea that he's just like using this because he has bad memory or something, and he's getting old and senile and he's forgetting. It's not true at all. That is not what's happening. And I think that's what makes this novel so moving in many ways. And the central question as well is not like, is this guy guilty of all the crimes of Japan or anything like that? It's not so ideological, which is obviously important. If you want a great novel, you want it to be sufficiently nuanced. But it's a question of, can any of us look at our life objectively, honestly? Can we rebuild after we've had mistakes or things that we've changed in the way we saw things in the past? And, as with all of Ishiguro's fantastic narrators, I think Ono really shows us what he can't, through the things he won't say, we learn the most about Ono's life. And I think that is really beautiful as well. Now, number 6 on this list is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This is a very inventive novel. I love it. Basically, you have 6 stories. You start with the first half of the earliest story chronologically. Then you move forward through history. You have the 6th story complete, and then the second half of the 5th, second half of the 4th, second half of the 3rd, and you end with the second half of the first story. So it's kind of this, if you imagine book opening and then you place another book on the inside, that's kind of the premise of this book. And I thought that was a very creative way to look at it. But each of these narratives is in a different area. So you have this epistolary approach, and he's traveling in New Zealand, or just outside of New Zealand, essentially, in the 19th century. Then the second story is letters from this young composer in like the 30s. And then you have this thriller in the 70s, kind of a conspiracy one. And then you have this imprisoned publisher that's basically contemporary at the time it was written. Then you have a near future dystopian interview-styled approach in Korea, or what will be the future of Korea. And finally, you have post-apocalyptic oral history in Hawaii. So you have all of these stories adding together, and each one gives you just different depths and insights and almost commentaries on all of the other ones. And I think it's just such a wonderful experimental reading experience. At least it was for me. And obviously it can feel very literary and experimental when you're first reading this, but I think that it's really a wonderful exploration of the human experience, because across these centuries, there's explorations of the exploits and the dominations and the deaths and the pieces of pain and all of the acts of evil and all the acts of good and all the little things that we do and the reverberations of those things throughout not our own stories, but other stories. And exploring that is really just extremely profound. Most of these characters have no idea what is going to happen in the other stories, and some of the stories don't even feel real within the world of the next one. They might be like a fictional book within the next story, but then that fictional book connects to a real story earlier, and all these characters have the similar birthmarks, and so you see these kind of connections. And the idea Cloud Atlas is like these souls that are traveling through time, but they're connected to one another. And it's done in a very playful and I think still meaningful and profound way. And I personally really was moved by this novel at a young age, which is part of the reason why I love it so much and have included it on this list. Number 7 is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. So I had to put another Ishiguro on this one. This is one I think more people will be familiar with, but this one's technically science fiction. It's kind of a retro-futuristic look. You have Kathy H. is this character that's looking back on her childhood at this boarding school, this idyllic kind of English school. She's remembering all these friendships with Ruth and Tommy, which are the main other characters, and it's all about the private jealousies and rumors and themes of the artwork and that they did as kids. But really, the story is much deeper than that, and I don't want to spoil too much because I'm not really sure how much I can say about this novel with spoiling it or without spoiling it, because it's revealed pretty early on what it's about. But I've also talked about it before and had people say, "Oh, that's spoiling." So better be safe than sorry this time. I won't say too much about exactly what happens, but through exploring these children's lives and a sort of contracted version of our lives in terms of length, in terms of depth, we get to see what do our lives look like when we're exploring desire and love and things that we should have said to those that we love, but it's too late. All of these questions that we all must have at various forms in our lives, because ultimately, whether we live 20 years or 100 years, there's always going to be misunderstandings and there's always going to be things that are not communicated as clearly as they should be. And this novel really lives in that space, and it communicates some of these ideas in an extremely affecting and deep, deep way. Um, Really, the story is a challenging one, but one that I highly recommend you read if you haven't before. It's one that I personally love. Now, number 8 on this list is The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. It's a really short novel. Unreliable narration is a very core theme here as well. And the version of our own pasts that we believe. Again, you have this character named Tony, and he sees himself as extremely, decent and normal guy, and he's recalling all these early relationships, and he recalls also the suicide of a classmate from his younger life, a very gifted person. And what else is there that happens in this plot? That's he receives an inheritance, and he's trying to understand why exactly he's retrieved this. But the main reason this novel is so wonderful is it's not about Tony just being like deceptive right off the face. It's about his self-deception. Like he is not telling things the way they are, but it's pretty clear that he doesn't see things the way they are because he can't see things that way. He's kind of twisting it in his own mind, and he's trying to be reasonable, and his narrative style is beautifully done. Julian Barnes is a wonderful writer, and it feels so reasonable, and it feels so like you can empathize with it. You're like, yeah, of course, this makes sense what this guy's saying. But then you start seeing these hints, these incongruities, and you're like, that can't be. There must be something more going on here. And this is really a book about the things that we don't consider, the consequences of our actions or inactions or thoughts or words that we don't consider. And partly this title refers to the idea that we want to impose like a story, a narrative, a coherent arc to the way our lives are. And this character Tony wants to do this, but our lives are ultimately messy and unresolved, and we have to be able to, as Maria Rilke says, live in the question sometimes, and that is something that Tony struggles with. Book 9 on this list is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. These aren't always going to be the books that you're going to want to read at every stage or every chapter of your life, or in certain times, these might not be the right books to read. But The Unbearable Lightness of Being is, man, it's a tour de force of introspection and memory and questions and philosophizing. And so if that is something you're interested in, this is one of the great books to read, set in the Prague Spring during the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. Really great historical setting for this book. And Kundera really organizes this novel around different philosophies, how they interact. Weight and lightness, very much themes, and responsibility and their lack of, very strong themes in this book. The idea that if we only live once, our decisions kind of, what is the weight of our decisions? How much do they matter? Do they have infinite depth or no depth because they're just like, it doesn't really matter, you only live once? Like, we could look at the same thing with very different philosophies, and Kundera really explores this. Weight, of course, bears a lot of responsibility. It brings commitment, and there's suffering that can come with that. But that is also what gives our lives meaning. If we don't have that, then what is life? Like, how unbearable could life be if it's totally light, if there's no responsibilities? And these characters are obviously moving between these contradictions and these questions all throughout this story. And it's really one of the greatest stories to explore these questions if you've ever really wondered. Does every moment matter? Should I live a little bit more freely? Kundera has been there before you, and he's a wonderful guide. He's not going to give you the answers, but he will help you to find some of the questions that you're looking for. And if you're looking for a novel that really thinks out loud and remains really vivid, allows you that opportunity, this is a wonderful place to start. Now, the final one on this list is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I've put 3 Ishiguro picks on this list. I know it's not normal for me to do 3 of the same writer, but Ishiguro is one of my favorite writers within this particular style. The Remains of the Day might be the perfect example of that really restrained, emotionally restrained version of this memory introspection story. You have Stevens, who's an aging butler, and he's devoted his entire life to serving this man named Lord Darlington. And during this journey, he's going through the English countryside on a break, and he reflects on his life, on his career, on his, in particular, his relationship with a woman that was there alongside him, and with all of the political gatherings that happened while he was at Lord Darlington's during the Second World War, and all of the conversations that he overheard, and the things he said and didn't say, did and didn't do in response to those. Now, Stevens really believes in dignity, and he takes great pride in his work as a gentleman, as a professional, but Darlington has some very questionable political judgments and things that he believes. And Stevens is asking himself, what did he serve? What were the things that he lived his life for? And at the same time, he's remembering Miss Kenton and the woman that he could have lived his life for but didn't. And he's questioning, did he live for the right thing? It never really gives us any dramatic confrontations. Ishiguro is remarkably subtle in his exploration of these themes, but in the end, Stevens has a lot to confront, and we have a lot to confront, and it's going to leave you with a lot of questions, not least of which is the title. What happens with the remains of the day when you reflect back on your life and you made a mistake, or you did things well, you did things not so well? What do you still have and what remains with you? So those are the 10 picks. Now, there are many more works of literary fiction I still need to read. For example, I mentioned before Virginia Woolf as some of the ones that I really want to start with. Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. I really like the Satanic Verses, so this is another one. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Atonement by Ian McEwan. The Memory Police is another one I've heard of, and The God of Small Things. The Bell Jar I've read partially, so that's another one I need to read. But what I really want to end by saying here is that literary fiction is a very broad category. There's a lot to be said. I think most people enjoy this particular style because we have these questions. We want to know what makes life meaningful. We want to wrestle with memory. We want to put ourselves in the position of someone looking back on their life and see, how could I have lived my life in the best possible way? And what can I do with the remains of my days? And we all have to look at things that way, regardless of whether there's 75 years or 25 or 10 or 5 or whatever. We don't have, as Gandalf says, it's not for us to decide, our time, only what to do with the time we are given. I paraphrased and kind of messed up the quote there to fit it to my purposes, so trust me that I do know the actual one. But let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy discussing great books, you can also join the reading room through Substack. We're doing the Phantom Toll booth in a couple of days, and there'll be lots more books to read in the future. But I really appreciate everyone for supporting this channel. Channel members, thank you so much to all of you guys for supporting this. I'm going to be making more content for you guys in particular because I really want to say thank you and I want to provide value, and you guys have been amazing and helped me to do what I do, so thank you. I also want to thank everybody in the book club for participation and for sharing your thoughts with me. It's helped me to grow as a person, and everybody for watching these videos and commenting and leaving me a ever-growing to-be-read list that I'll probably never finish, but it really is amazing to be able to relate to and talk with and share ideas with other people who just absolutely love and adore great works of literature. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and please do leave a comment about your favorite literary fiction books, however you define that category, what you consider to be literary fiction, and if you like this video, of course, you can like and subscribe and join the community, but I'm looking forward to hearing some of your comments below. I will see you guys in the next one. Take care and happy reading.